I think you can very easily make the argument that Spider-Man 2 is the best comic book movie ever made. And I say comic book movie and not movie inspired by a comic book or with elements from a comic book, because a lot of people obviously like Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. I know I do. But are they really comic book movies in the same way something like the Marvel EU movies or the earlier Batman movies like Batman and Batman Returns, or even maybe something like James Bond, where there's a certain degree of camp, a certain lack of realism, whereas a lot of unrealistic things happen in the Nolan movies. You could almost make the case that they're more action thriller movies than a comic book movie per se. In terms of a movie that tries to capture, I guess, comic books at their highest and at their best, I would definitely say Spider Man 2 is probably the ultimate example of this. It's the rare example of a film that succeeds on basically every level. The acting's good, the characters are good, the writing's good, the pacing's good, the humor's good. It has, and I maintain, some of the best action scenes ever put on film. I remember when I saw this movie when it first came out back in 2004. I thought the special effects on Dr. Octopus's tentacles were like the best thing I'd ever seen in a movie. And as an adult, like 16 years later, they're just as impressive now as they used to be. The CG in this movie is really good. It hasn't really aged poorly at all. It's still really exciting and really on the edge of your seat. If you haven't watched the Spider-Man trilogy, I'd really recommend it. The only issue with the Spider-Man trilogy is if you're someone who cringes really easily or finds like people having their lives destroyed too hard to watch, and to a certain degree like I'm like that, you'll find these movies kind of difficult. That's not because of any failing. In fact, that's kind of what they're going for, and we'll get into that in a minute. But it can kind of be hard for me to rewatch these movies and watch specific scenes dealing with Peter's daily life just because it's so depressing. But like I said, I think it's really well done and it thematically makes sense. It just can be a little challenging to watch those parts. Before we get into the plot and start talking about the movie proper, I just want to say if you ever find yourself, for whatever reason, transported into the Marvel Universe, never, ever, whatever you do, become a father figure to Peter Parker. If you become a father figure to Peter Parker, you either die or go insane or become the main villain. I mean, just those three movies, we have obviously Uncle Ben, we have Doc Ock, we have Norman Osborn, we have, I think there's a couple other people. There's the guy in Amazing Spider-Man. There's just a lot of them. It's just a place you really don't want to be. So if you meet Peter and you're an older male, then just be a dick to him and don't give him life advice. Anyway, so the movie takes up 2 years after the events of Spider-Man 1. And as my friend Serp really likes to point out about Spider-Man, because he's a big Spider-Man fan, the villain in Spider-Man is not really Doc Ock or the Green Goblin or Venom. The villain is life, to use a Joss Whedon quote from that one season of Buffy. The villain's life, and the villain is the rent. Spider-Man doesn't really have that many problems dealing with supervillains. He has trouble with his personal life. And kind of one of the ironies of Spider-Man's character is his motto is with great power comes great responsibility, but he's extremely irresponsible in his personal life. Like he doesn't pay his rent, he doesn't turn in papers on time, he's not there for his friends, all that kind of stuff. He's not there for Aunt May when she needs him. And you do feel kind of resentment towards Peter in these movies because he's not there for the other people in his life. So, in a sense, he's very responsible, but in another sense, he's completely irresponsible. And his inability to balance the two things is, I think, kind of what makes him unique and different. Like, Batman's a billionaire, so he doesn't have to really work for a living. And having a secret identity doesn't really matter. Likewise, Tony Stark's a billionaire. I don't know in DC if the Justice League members get paid by Bruce or they get a stipend. I assume the Avengers probably get paid by the US government. But like Peter doesn't have that. He has to make his money doing odd jobs, which he inevitably screws up because he's Spider-Man, or doing low-paid contract work for the Daily Bugle, in which Jameson abuses him both as Peter and as Spider-Man. So, anyways, back to the movie. So, the film starts off with Peter Parker trying to struggle civilian life. He's still in love with Mary Jane, even though he turned her down at the beginning of the first movie, because he doesn't want her to get involved with Spider Man's enemies and that sort of thing. And because he won't be able to commit to her properly and give her the attention that she needs. You have a really cringy scene at the start of the movie where Peter's delivering pizzas, and because he keeps stopping to save people on the way to deliver pizzas, it passes the 30 minutes or it's free timeline, and the company probably loses like over $100 worth of pizzas because of it. So he gets fired from that. Um, Aunt May has no ability to pay the rent on her house, so it winds up getting foreclosed on, and she has to move out. Peter's landlord, who's kind of a dick, but to be fair, like, Peter doesn't pay him his rent, and he kind of does need his rent to pay his taxes and to pay for the building. So you can't really blame him for hating Peter for not paying his rent. He doesn't pay his rent. He's not turning in papers on time, and despite his brilliance, he's gonna get failed. So basically, everything in Peter's life is going really, really bad, aside from being a web slinging superhero. He also attempts to take pictures other than pictures of Spider Man, but it doesn't wind up working out. So yeah, everything's going bad. Peter tells Dr. Connors that he's going to write his paper on Dr. Otto Octavius. Otto Octavius's fusion research is getting funded by Oscorp, so Harry introduces him to him, and Doc Ock immediately becomes a father figure to him. It gives him life advice, and they're talking. And initially, Doc Ock doesn't want to talk to Peter, but Peter like actually understands his research, and they get into like a big talk. And Doc Ock invites him to the whole thing where they're going to do do the fusion experiment. The idea being, of course, to create cheap, unlimited, clean, renewable energy. So Peter goes to the actual event the next day, and this is where Doc Ock gets the four mechanical arms or tentacles or whatever you want to call them. So the explanation that's given is because they're made out of some sort of extremely heat resistant material, they're going to be used so he can operate multiple controls at the same time, and also he can use them to kind of push parts of the fusion back in if it's not working properly. I mean, this is a comic book movie, and I mean it's really a comic book movie, so like campy stuff happens a lot, and like unrealistic stuff happens a lot. So that doesn't really bother me. I mean, it's as good an excuse as anything. And maybe just take a second. The thing that Sam Raimi is really good at is he's good at mixing camp and drama. Like the Spider-Man movies have a lot of heart, a lot of depth to them, a lot of good character interaction, and that's blended very well with really goofy kind of over the top stuff in a lot of cases. And I think it's really hard to properly blend those two things together. Like to have scenes where Jameson's running around in the Spider-Man costume pretending to shoot webs, or scenes where Peter's somehow able to stop a speeding train. with his own strength and the help of his webs. Like, it's hard to have that in the same movie as Spider-Man struggling to pay the rent, but he really succeeds to do it. So what I'm saying is, it may be a somewhat flimsy excuse for him to get the mechanical arms, but I'm okay with that. And the arms themselves are some of the coolest things I ever seen. They did a really good job of balancing, like they look like something that could exist, but would be too difficult to make for physical limitations. Just they'd be too heavy, or you wouldn't have a power source, or something like that. And they do a really good job just in how they animate them or how they did the effects. So like whenever he's walking, the legs are always doing some, it's kind of hard to describe, but just the way they move and they're always grabbing things just feels very fluid and very organic. The arms themselves all have separate AIs in them. And initially there's a chip that he puts at the top with no shielding whatsoever that's extremely fragile that prevents the AI in it from mind controlling him, which of course breaks, and that's why he goes criminally insane. But the arms are cool because they can rip buildings apart, but they can also hold like teacups or cigars or glasses or do very delicate work at the same time, despite being these giant monster arms, which is once again kind of this interesting touch. So obviously the fusion experiment doesn't work. It goes out of control. Uh, Doctor Doc Ock, Spider-Man manages to come in and pull the plug on it and stop it, but the chip on Doc Ock's thing breaks. And then later on, he's at the hospital, and they're going to cut off the arms and remove the thing from him. But the arms obviously want to survive. So the arms kill all the doctors. And what's a rather scary and gruesome scene, to be honest. So then he takes refuge in a broken down building in the harbor. Now, what's interesting about Doc Ock in the harbor is there's a really cool scene where he's fighting with it. There's a certain Shakespearean quality to this movie, both in terms of Doc Ock is very much a tragic villain, where he was a good man who had good intentions, but a combination of tragedy, like his wife died, he's become a freak, he failed in his life's work, and you have kind of like this demonic scene where it looks like the arms are talking to him. Like they I think they move their mouths almost like they're speaking to him, and they manage to convince him that all he has left is to complete his experiment, but this time make it bigger and better. And to do that, he's going to need money. And at first, he's like, "No, I'm not a thief." But then he goes, "Oh, wait, the real crime would not to be to not finish this project." And we get one of the best action scenes in any movie when he goes to the uh, bank, because Peter Parker's there, having been there to try to get a loan with Aunt May, and he rips open the bank vault. Now, it's very comic bookish, but there's bags full of coins in the bank vault, so I don't know if they're supposed to be gold or whatever it is, because the US doesn't really use coins for any kind of large denomination. But we get this cool scene where he's like throwing bags of money at Spider-Man, and he like tries to get away, and we have this amazing fight scene on the side of a building where he's like tearing off chunks of the building and throwing it at Peter, and he kidnaps Aunt May, and we have it's just a really epic scene. And Spider-Man succeeds in saving Aunt May, but Doc Ock gets away and he starts to rebuild his fusion machine. So Mary Jane, in kind of a bounce back because Peter is not like being her simp, goes and finds Chad, specifically John Jameson, who is J. Jonah Jameson's son, and he's like a Chad astronaut. So Peter gets cucked by Chad, and he kind of goes into a depression over that. He quits being Spider Man for a while at least, and his grades get better. I don't know if he really does better at work, but he is finally kind of getting his life on track. The crime rate in the city is massively increasing. People are dying. There's a scene where there's a building on fire, and he runs into the building to save a child. But it turns out that there was actually another person on the fifth floor. And if he had been able to use his full powers of Spider Man, he would have been able to save that person. And there's a really good scene where he talks to Uncle Ben's ghost, and Uncle Ben's ghost tries to tell him, like, no, you have to sacrifice everything to be Spider Man. And Peter's like, that was your dream, not mine. I have a right to my own life. I have a right to have my own existence separate from Spider Man. And that's kind of the ongoing conflict in the movie. So he tells Aunt May what wound up happening that gets Uncle Ben killed. Initially, it looks like she's just going to have a breakdown, but in the next scene he sees her, she forgives him. And she gives a speech which basic about how there's a hero in all of us. And it's pretty clear, I think in the comic book adaptation it's explicitly stated, but I think it's pretty clear that Aunt May knows, or at least very strongly suspects, that Peter is Spider-Man, and she's more or less encouraging him to go back and to start doing it again, start being a hero again. There's kind of a funny scene where some homeless guy finds Spider-Man's costume in a dumpster, and taking the costume, he sells it to Jameson, and because Jameson's so cheap, he only gives him like $100 for it. And there's a scene where where Jameson kind of finally realizes that Spider-Man was necessary, and he's like gonna apologize to him, and he just wants Spider-Man back. And then Spider-Man comes in and steals the costume back. And then Jameson like just gives up on uh his whole thing and goes back to hating Spider-Man and thinking that he's a menace and stuff like that. So a bunch of other stuff happens. Uh, Doc Ock goes to Harry to demand more tritium because that's the only thing he can't buy with money. It's something only someone with Harry's connections would have. And the deal is if Doc Ock brings Peter, or rather, if Doc Ock brings Spider Man to Harry so Harry can kill him to get revenge for his father. So to do that, Harry directs Doc Ock towards Peter, and there is a lot of Christ imagery in this movie. Like there's a scene where Peter gets carried through a train and his arms are spread out in a cross. It's very much like a Judas move where Harry's selling out Peter for kind of his own petty revenge. But I mean, tritium silver. There's also a scene later where Doc Ock has Peter wrapped up in uh, barbed wire, which I think you can maybe see as a Crown of Thorns reference. And Doc Ock's ultimate death in the water. Water is generally in a movie seen as a cleansing element, like that scene in what was it called, Shawshank Redemption, and kind of dying in the water is kind of seen as, I don't know, a second baptism or him kind of getting repentance. I mean, obviously Sam Raimi is Jewish, but there is a lot of Christ themes surrounding Spider-Man, which is something I always like. But yeah, so Doc Ock goes and kidnaps Mary Jane again and demands that Peter bring Spider-Man to fight him. So Peter goes after him in the form of Spider-Man, and we get another one of the greatest action scenes of all time, where Doc Ock and Peter fight on top of a train, then they fight in the train, and Peter gets his ass kicked. And he just gets beaten up really bad, and uh, Doc Ock winds up destroying the controls on the train, and Peter has to stop it before it runs off of the tracks, and everyone on board dies. And this is where we get one of the campiest movies where, like, Peter literally tries to stop the train by like putting his foot down. He ultimately is able to do it by making a bunch of webs and literally like holding the webs together, and he like is somehow able to stop the train. I mean, once again, like I said, this is an actual comic book movie. Like you wouldn't see something like that in The Dark Knight. It doesn't bother me or anything. And this film is campy enough that stuff like that just kind of happens. It's a very touching moment. Peter's really badly beat up for it. He has his mask ripped off at a point during the fight. So, like I said, the people in the train bring him in. His arms are out in the shape of the cross. There's also like a scene where all the people are like looking at Peter, and someone says he's just a kid. He's no older than my son. And the people are just like, and I tear up a bit because it's a very touching scene. All the people just go, "We won't tell anyone, Spider Man. We love you. We understand the sacrifices you make for us." And just kind of the acknowledgement, just Spider Man getting that personal gratitude and the personal love of the people he's fought to protect is, like I said, just very touching scene. I almost kind of tear up. And then Doc Ock comes in, and Peter's still really badly beat up. So he gets his mask back, though. So Doc Ock doesn't know that Spider Man is Peter Parker. And basically, everyone on the train's like, "You're going to have to kill me. Because Spider Man's our hero. He saved us. It's time we stood up for him." And ultimately, it doesn't work because Doc Ock just knocks them all out of the way. But once again, it's a very touching scene. And I kind of want to contrast that maybe with the scene in The Dark Knight with the two ships and that kind of thing. Despite like the depression of Peter's life, these movies are a lot more optimistic, and there are a lot less I kind of concerned with good versus evil being ambiguous. You have a lot of characters who were like heroic in some ways, but kind of fell. Like it was kind of that with Norman Osborn, who is this extremely well accomplished scientist, businessman. A lot of people saw him as kind of heroic in a series of events of people screwing with him and him sacrificing himself for science and that kind of thing drove him to insanity. Doc Ock is once again was a good man who wanted to help the world, but he's kind of been driven insane. I forget what his name is. Clint, whoever Sandman is in the third one, is also a bad guy, but he's trying to help his like uh sick and dying family. So it's not necessarily not saying good and evil don't exist. It's that there's a struggle in every man's soul, and some men are stronger than others. And Peter, whatever his faults, is strong enough to stay on the side of good, even as some of the other people give in to despair and fall to the side of evil. So some of the people fall to the side of evil. Some of the Spider-Man obviously stays good. So Doc Ock takes him back to Harry. Like I said, he's wrapped up in barbed wire, which I kind of see as a crown of thorns thing. And Harry takes off his mask, and he can't accept that Peter is his best friend is also his mortal enemy. So he just tells Harry, "Look, there's bigger things here than you and me. Doc Ock's gone crazy. He's gonna blow up the city with a fusion bomb. You gotta let me go." So he reaches there. We have another awesome fight scene between Doc Ock and Peter as the reactor's starting to go critical, and it's pretty clear it's going to blow the city up. So they fight, and Spider Man more or less gains the upper hand against him. But rather than killing him, he just says, "Look, you used to be a good man once. Um, there's still time for you to redeem yourself. Bad stuff happened to you. You're kind of being mind controlled, but you still have a decision. You can still choose to do the right thing. As good as your dream is, the greater good comes first," which is kind of one of the lessons of this film, that ultimately the greater good comes first for Peter. Even if being Spider-Man is going to destroy his life, he's kind of come terms to the fact that that's kind of his primary identity, and Peter's kind of second. So we have a really kind of heartwarming scene where Doc Ock is arguing with his arms, and after an immense amount of effort, he gets them to obey him. So he goes and breaks down the struts holding up the fusion reactor, and it falls into the ocean. And he drowns because he can't swim with the arms on. And once again, there's kind of this water is redemption, water is like a second baptism. He's repented, even if it's at the end of his life, and he decided to do the right thing. So that I think is very touching. Mary is gonna marry. Sorry, yeah, Mary is gonna marry the Chad, but she leaves him at the altar and runs to Peter and is like, "I'm okay with you not being there for me and ignoring me because you're Spider-Man, you're the Spider Chad, and you out Chad the astronaut Chad." So I feel bad for the astronaut guy because he kind of got like dunked on and publicly embarrassed. So I mean that's sad. But Mary Jane encourages him to go fight crime. And then the movie ends with a very Hamlet esque scene. There's a lot of almost kind of a Shakespearean tragedy to this movie, where his father appears to him in a mirror and demands that he kill Peter to avenge him. And Harry is just very conflicted and he throws something at the mirror and the mirror breaks and he discovers all of his father's equipment from his time as the Green Goblin in the hidden room. And I guess as the major theme of this movie is choice, Harry's kind of now presented with a choice. Is he going to do the right thing, realize his father was evil, and that even though Spider Man didn't directly kill his father, if Spider Man killed his father, he did it for a good reason, and that he has to forgive Peter and move on with his life? Or is he going to take up his father's mantle, make the same mistakes he did, and go down the dark but easy path? So, like I said, on the whole, this movie is great. You could probably watch this movie without seeing Spider-Man 1, but I'd recommend you might as well watch Spider-Man 1 because it's also a really good movie. It has a very good performance by William Dafoe as the Green Goblin. Uh, there's a lot of kind of cringy, awkward moments with Peter, and he really kind of grows into his own a lot more in this movie. But overall, I'm gonna say this is an amazing movie. This is like a 10 out of 10 movie. Still some of the best action scenes ever put on film. If Sam Raimi never did anything else, if he never did Army of Darkness or Evil Dead or the other Spider-Man films, this alone I think would make him one of the truly great directors. So I hope you enjoyed the review. God bless, and more films to come.